Here is a chair which one associates now with Regency as we sort of know it. Grotesque sort of massive figures. Big pair of sphinxes there, carved winged sphinx for those supports, and a nice wrought iron curly tail with a little gilt finial on the end, and with animals' legs carved at the back with hoof feet. But that's the sort of features you see. And here is another chair. This one, a set of 10 here in the pavilion, and this appeared in a book published by George Smith about 1807. Here now you've got everything. The head of Medusa there, black and gold, this gilt decoration, these scrolls, the Anthemion, honeysuckle. There it nearly always is on Regency stuff. More cane panels, cane back. This a good feature here. Invariably on plain friezes and anywhere around tables where there is going to be a star, it's either applied like this or is inlaid in brass. And there we go down, having passed these leopards' heads, down to leopards' feet, gilt paw feet down there. And these rather interest me because you see they're so designed that the animal seems to be going that way. His back legs, instead of splaying out to give plenty of support, my word, this chair is strong enough, they're shaped to go in that way, so you get the idea of the animal going along. And here's a bit more of George Smith. Lovely quality, just a mahogany open bookcase. That more or less describes it, apart from these columns. Look at this carving of that man's mask head. Beautifully carved head, going right down. Egyptian influence once more, right down. The feet show it. There they are, Egyptian feet. And this sort of table was very popular in the early part of the 19th century. Italian tables. People who went on the grand tour brought these back. Nice, this one quite nice, inlaid with semi-precious stones, and a large armorial on the top. But that could be nearly anything. But when you look underneath there, now you see what it is. Dolphins. 3 beautifully carved dolphins standing up, as it were, on their heads, holding up this marble top. Again, a flat triangular base and gilt scroll feet. But dolphins, there's a lot of dolphins in Brighton.
There are indeed, and most of them, it seems, are here in the Royal Pavilion. This is the South Drawing Room, and it really is like a furniture aquarium. There are dolphins decorating this and supporting that, dolphins all over the place. And when you look at this sofa, you may well say to yourself, well, that really is too much. It's the flamboyance of the Regency period gone absolutely mad. Indeed, Prinny himself may well have thought so, because this dolphin furniture was not actually here in his day. It was donated later by a lady called appropriately Mrs. Fish. And the reason it's here is, however flamboyant, it's still regarded as among the finest furniture the Regency produced. More dolphins you see on this armchair. Why are they here? Why so many of them? Well, it's said that the dolphins reflect the euphoria felt in Britain at the time as a result of the great victories of Nelson and his captains. And that is also reflected in the centerpiece of this room, a magnificent torchère surmounted by a glass vase. And you see on this painted panel here, commemoration of Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. But that, of course, was only one of the Admiral's great engagements, and I've no doubt that these sphinxes reflect the victory at the Nile. And there on the front to the memory of Lord Viscount Nelson. And all this is really so typical of the Regency. Very fond they were of commemorating naval and military victories of one kind or another. And this military influence is seen on these chairs. First of all, with this cable twist, a tribute to the Navy, and here the cavalry sword reflected in that saber leg. And so to this sofa table and yet more dolphins, 4 of them, 1 on each corner, supporting that central column. And that's just one of several fine sofa tables in the Royal Pavilion.
Well, I'm sure you'll realise that several sofa tables have been brought into the corner of this room just for me to talk about sofa tables. They're all the same, bear in mind. They've all got 2 flaps and they've all got 2 drawers. So virtually all these 5 tables are the same in that respect. Flaps on the short sides, this side. Flaps when they're on the long side of tables become Pembroke tables. These are sofa tables. And here is a perfect example of a straightforward Regency table. You see the wide band of inlaid brass all around the top. You notice brass mouldings, always a plentiful supply of brass. Nice column down there, all the ornament there in brass, and of course quadruple supports with brass casters. No one could mistake that for anything but Regency. But of course there's some 30 years in the Regency period, and obviously designs change a bit. Here's another Regency table in rosewood again. They like rosewood. But you see 2 brass lines here, no smothered with brass, 2 brass lines and little brass flower heads inlaid at intervals all round. And because this table is later like that, you see the only difference in these is the columns. And there is, to my mind, quite an ugly column, a nasty, round, heavy central column there with these collars all round it and the nasty, heavy gadroons. No criticism of the period, but just a like or a dislike of my own, because that again is pure Regency. And here's another one. This table's just about into the 19th century, and only just about 1801 or 2 or 3, in mahogany, no brass, nice cross-grained border to the top, and 4 little turn columns there which make it rather pretty, and concave arrangement there with the quadruple legs and the brass claw casters. That, to my mind, is perhaps the most likeable one of the 3 at the moment we've seen. There's another Regency one here, you see, rosewood again, all picked curls, good top, but no columns now, all columns taken away in favour of what we call end standards. End standards come in all sorts of forms. In the 18th century, they were square and straight, but in the 19th century, they become lyre-shaped, just like that. The legs come up with a little bump over the top, and that makes that, again, Regency. And this is the true purpose of a sofa table. It doesn't just happen, but they fitted as this against this sofa. Here would sit the person with little things that he or she might want in these drawers, and there they were. They're shams on the one side and drawers on the other. And the last table of all, of course, is what you might say absolutely pure Regency. Every sort of thing inlaid with brass. Wide brass border all the way around, inlaid with brass, everywhere on that column, every single where, even on the brackets, you see, that support the top. Look at that. When you bring out that bracket, smothered in brass. Anthemion, honeysuckle, everything that one could associate with Regency, and of course, lovely coromandel. Nice wood coromandel, just like ebony, hard as a brick, and really a very attractive wood. So, a very good sofa table.
Almost everywhere you go in this extraordinary building, you're confronted with Eastern and Oriental influences of one kind or another. Outside, we're in the world of Islam. Here, we're in a Chinese world. Just look at this magnificent bamboo staircase, or so it appears at first glance. But look a little more closely. This bamboo is in fact cast iron, and you see in their attempt at simulation they've even gone so far as to paint in these knotholes here. And this stair rail is not bamboo, again, it's mahogany. And so into the corridor, really looking a bit like a Peking palace. Very much the same today as it was in George IV's time, and nothing could reflect more accurately his taste for the Chinese influence. This is one of 3 small armchairs that were imported from China around about 1800. But the real bamboo furniture in this room is actually in the minority. This is made by an English craftsman. It's actually satinwood on that pier table. No king since the time of Charles II had had a more profound influence on the craftsmen of his period than did George IV. And wherever you go, whether it's in the grand staterooms or the small private apartments, you find all over the place pieces of furniture that remain today as a testament to the magnificent skill of those early 19th century craftsmen.
Many of these things are so unusual that perhaps you could feel you could not live with them. But we brought now a few things together that I myself like very much and feel that anybody could live with these. Anybody could live with this chair. There are 4 here. They just interest me because they happen to have been designed by Henry Holland, and you will remember he was the fellow who first designed the first house here. But there can't be anything much more simple than this. Nice reeded arms, padded, pretty, a little bit of shape, square frame, standing on front, turned, tapering legs, fluted. Not much else, but do you remember now the chairs we spoke about made by George Smith? Those that had the leopard's head arms and all the pad feet going the same way. This is the sort of leg that one usually expects to find on a biggish sort of chair, a leg splaying out backwards. And that's why I said those were so unusual, because they all seem to go that way. This is pretty, look. Just a nice little feature in the upholstery there. Reminds me so of a very nice draped pelmet for some nice silk curtains. Just pretty. Now for the little bits of Regency furniture that everyone will recognize as Regency. This, by its brass panel here, a little adjustable music chair, and nothing much else to say about it except that it's just very pleasant and would stand very easily by any piano, no matter whether it was a modern one or an old one. Little modern bit of needlework on there that perhaps helps it along a bit. But this is the thing I like. Now, I do like this because I love quality, and this just oozes quality. There is the top. You see little engraved brass spandrels, a nice oval inlaid brass center there, and little pearls along here, just cut, just carved, and brass ovalo mouldings, solid brass mouldings. And underneath, our old friend, the lyre's back with us. Lovely lyre-shaped supports there. And more brass down below, much more. This is all solid brass, and brass inlaid down the quadruple legs with the usual little brass claw casters. Now that's pretty. And it's nice when you open it, because it is a teapot. Has 4 little caddy boxes, and misses, because I suppose they've been broken, the 2 cut glass mixing bowls. And let's have a look at these little boxes. Now there they are, made out of 8-inch wood, tiny little dovetails holding them together, and a lid which fits nicely. And there is one made, and it goes in that hole there and just falls down like that. Here's another one here, just the same, less than 1/8 of an inch wood, a lid that fits well in mahogany. There's where it came from. No matter where you put them, this is the quality. No matter where you put them, they go in. Look at this. That one goes in the wrong one and slides down. That one goes in the wrong ones and slides down and puffs air out. Now then, that's why these things are still about. They're not about by accident. This has been used. The 2 glass bowls have been broken and gone. This is just here because of its quality and the care that a cabinet maker exercised in making that bit of furniture. That's why antiques are about, the quality and the manner in which they went to endless trouble to make, a little work table like that. See, lyre-shaped standards there again, the little quadruple supports, and of course, a pretty little work table. Can't you see years ago the little ivory spools there, each holding coloured silks? And here's the way you get into the needlework bag. When you've finished, you put the unfinished work down there and close the thing up, and just a pretty little table. Nice writing table there, again in rosewood. You remember the sofa table? I didn't like that nasty round column, because there's a prettier column, a nice round support there from which spring those 4 quadruple legs there, and very pretty acanthus leaf casters. Now what about people who collect little miniature bits? What about this little cylinder top table? Little cylinder top desk like that, 3 little drawers underneath and a cylinder front. Lovely pilasters here with the gilt capitals and eagle claw feet. Of course, it's not a writing desk at this size, but look what they've done. Now, isn't that pretty? 6 engraved glass decanters, liqueur decanters, and 2 liqueur glasses, so cleverly arranged that you can shut it down with no fear of breaking anything. The glasses just slide into 2 little holes there, and there's the thing. Now then, people who collect miniature bits, isn't that sweet? And it usually ends up, these programs, as you now know, with something I particularly like. I don't know that perhaps that would look well in a flat in which I live, but nevertheless, I shan't forget these tools. Huge scallop shell, just look at that. Beautifully carved. And what's it do? Well, of course, it rests, look, on a great big fat juicy dolphin, sort of holding all that up just like that. And here in the pavilion there are just 4 of those, and I really think they are delightful.
George IV died in June 1830, and his Brighton pavilion is in so many ways a fitting memorial to the man the Duke of Wellington once described as the most extraordinary compound of talent, wit, buffoonery, obstinacy, and good feeling I ever saw in my life. And his pavilion is also a memorial to a whole era, because by the time it was completed, the robust exuberance of Georgian England was already giving way to the more sober virtues of the Victorians. We're going to look now at some of the developments of English furniture during the reigns of William IV and Queen Victoria, a time when domestic virtues and material prosperity were top priorities, and even the dolls lived in snug and well-upholstered comfort. Now, by the time George IV died in 1830, the elegance and gaiety of the Regency period had disappeared, along with the supremacy of the Georgian aristocrats who for 100 years had been the arbiters of taste. With the knowledge and confidence bred in grand houses and fostered on the grand tour, they had ensured a standard of excellence in design that had never been equalled. But by the 1830s, the middle classes were already a social force to be reckoned with, and because they were also extremely rich, their taste, their habits and values had an important influence on the fashions of the day. The average newly wealthy man, and there were many created by the Industrial Revolution, not unnaturally wanted to show the world that he could afford the best money could buy, and the result was a great deal of vulgar ostentation. And when it came to a choice of style, he wasn't really at all sure what that style ought to be, and was therefore very much at the mercy of the manufacturers. The stylistic free-for-all that followed outdid even the Regency, and in Victorian times there were many different design influences at work. Now, just take this chair as an example. 16th century in parts, 17th century in others. A little bit of Jacobean, a little bit of Elizabethan. The Elizabethan period made popular for the Victorians by the novels of Sir Walter Scott. And exactly the same applies to this corner cupboard in oak. At first glance, it looks Elizabethan, doesn't it? But it's very definitely Victorian, made, of course, in the Elizabethan style. And up here, in this Romaine panel, yet another influence at work. Do you remember in an earlier program when talking about 16th century furniture, we mentioned these Romaine panels as an Italian influence on the furniture of that period? Well, here it is, back again in Victorian times and repeated. And in the very same room as these pieces, you might well find this, a settee in the Adam style, decorated with paintings reminiscent of Angelica Kauffmann. This would certainly have been more comfortable than anything Adam himself ever designed. And the person who ordered this for his Victorian home was very fortunate in his choice of maker. A superb example of a Sheraton-style Carlton House desk, named after a desk made for Carlton House in the late 18th century, and a design for which appeared in Sheraton's drawing book. Just look at the craftsmanship in this, particularly the delicacy of the inlay work on these panels. This was made, probably, in the 1860s.
The rest of the furniture might be Greek or Egyptian, Italian or French. Take that brass stand, for instance, absolutely smothered in Rococo mounts. The Davenport is essentially a Regency design, but the Victorians liked it a lot and so used the design and developed it still further, as they did the Canterbury, which is a music stand, and you'll see many Victorian variations on the same theme as that. And so to this rather spindly-looking whatnot, and these turn spirals which support it are very reminiscent of the sort of things we saw earlier on Jacobean furniture. But this is not to say that as time went on, the Victorians didn't develop their very own style in furniture making, and this sideboard is typical of that, a massive symbol of prosperity and good living on which other symbols of prosperity and good living would have stood. The balloon-back chair is also a genuinely Victorian piece of furniture. It would be impossible to mistake that for anything than what it is, a Victorian dining chair. And the same sort of balloon-back design is used in this rather more comfortable, upholstered, button-back ladies' chair, it's called, although sometimes mistakenly referred to as a nursing chair, one of the few really elegant pieces of furniture that the Victorians produced. Now, this was known as a conversazione, very popular in Victorian times, and this incised decoration along the top here is absolutely typical of Victorian furniture. I must say, though, it's rather difficult to see how more than two people could have had a conversazione on that without getting a crick in the neck. And so to another really typical piece of Victorian furniture. This could only belong to the Victorian period. A heavy, solid, sober armchair with a button back. The coiled spring, incidentally, was introduced in the Victorian period, and this made upholstered seats even more comfortable. And in some houses, you would have found a chair or several such as this. They were made for the devout, made not to sit on, but to kneel on. And they took their name from the French. They were known as a prie-dieu. The style that best suited the devout mood of early Victorian England was the Gothic. Not the frivolous Gothic of the previous century, but the gloomy and portentous Gothic eloquent of moral uplift that had begun to appear in the 1820s. The name most associated with 19th century Gothic designs is that of Augustus Welby Pugin, who assisted in the designing and building of the new Houses of Parliament in the 1830s. This is the House of Lords, and this is the impressive Gothic throne he designed for Queen Victoria. Many of Pugin's designs were comparatively restrained, but the publicity given to his more spectacular efforts resulted in an epidemic of pinnacles, crockets and tracery applied without discrimination to all kinds of furniture, and which Pugin denounced over and over again in his critical writings. The Gothic style even reached into the humblest of pieces. This humble little piece is, believe it or not, an umbrella stand. Well, one writer who was anxious to improve standards of design was J.C. Loudon. His Encyclopedia of Cottage, Farm and Villa Architecture first appeared in 1833, and it was reissued no less than 10 times. Now, in this book, he is vitriolic about contemporary fashions, especially about the vulgar and grovelling taste of wealthy patrons who try to achieve a display of rich workmanship at as cheap a rate as possible. But he wasn't only concerned to raise the standards of the middle classes. He included designs for a range of cheap and practical furniture suitable for cottages, inns and servants' bedrooms that could be made by country joiners. Now, mass production was growing in all kinds of industry. The Victorians boasted that England was the workshop of the world, and in 1851 they mounted the Great Exhibition to show the world what they could make. It was housed in a building specially designed for the occasion, the Crystal Palace. Nearly 1 million square feet of glass were attached to 30 miles of iron framework, and the whole extraordinary edifice was put up in Hyde Park. The exhibition attracted 6 million visitors, and there were 15,000 exhibits of all kinds from all over the world. And there was, of course, a great deal of furniture, including a huge Renaissance bedstead made of brass, and something no home should be without, a dressing table that doubled as a fire escape. Much of the furniture was chosen to show off the use of new techniques and unusual materials. This stand, for example, was run by Jennens and Bettridge, who were just one of the firms displaying their products made of papier-mâché.
So here is some papier-mâché, and I expect everyone knows exactly what that is. You've all played about with it at school, probably making puppets and things, but it was discovered, invented actually in 1772. It became terribly popular after a decline, but terribly popular in Victorian times. There's some. Now, what's that look like? Just like a black and gold Japanese lacquer cabinet. Must look just like that. And even when the doors are open, it looks just the same. There it is, a nice interior, smothered with gilt chinoiserie. Just look at it. That, in fact, is papier-mâché. The surface is, it's all mahogany lined, and it's decorated like that over this layers of paper, laminated paper, and bears the firm's name, Jennings and Bettridge. And what a nice firm they were, because they saw the desirability of perhaps introducing paper, papier-mâché, on articles of wood. This is an ebonized cane seat chair, nothing more, but it has just that one little oval panel there of papier-mâché, painted with those lilies of the valley. Here is a papier-mâché chair. The whole thing is virtually paper. Each sheet applied on a metal frame until the required surface is reached, and then polished and finished with all sorts of things. And look at the way it's decorated. Someone's been to a lot of trouble to make that very attractive. There's no doubt about that. And trays, well, there wasn't a preponderance of trays. There were trays everywhere. And 10 thicknesses of paper usually was the number of sheets required before you got a tray like this. And when you got it, it was absolutely like a board. You could plane it, you could scrape it, you could do anything with it. And it has one great advantage: it doesn't warp. That's quite something. But here's a pretty thing. Now, by any standards, no matter what's this made of, just look at that. Now, who could quarrel with that? I'm beginning to like this stuff myself a bit, because, well, this is nice. Look, see? A little lady's everything. Manicure set in there. One lifts up the top. Everything she requires for her dressing table. Lovely cut glass jars, pin trays, everything. Engraved silver tops, hallmarked, of course. 1849, just the right date. And see what happens down below when you open the doors. Little fitted drawer there. You see, what for? Jewellery. And the drawer below it is even more exciting, because this is a complete thing in itself. A little writing desk. You've seen hundreds of these in mahogany and rosewood. Here's one in paper, papier-mâché. Absolutely beautiful. So that adds up, by any standards, to a very nice article. Again signed, Jennings and Bettridge. There's another one, doors open just the same. Different design with pillars. Here's a pretty thing. I like little caddies. I like them in all sorts of funny shapes. I like them when they're finished to represent something unusual. What about that for malachite? Isn't that a lovely colour? And believe me, on that wood, it is paper. And that is beautiful. And so is this table. The last little bit, but what a nice little bit to end with. Get away from the table and look at it. Take in that flat-shaped base, the leafage of the pillar, the column, and then have a quick look at this. Now, what about that for a picture? Fancy a man painting this. But this is layers of paper once more. One thing I did omit to say was this business of this shell. This is not mother of pearl. It is shell. It is not inlaid. It's a mistaken idea. The shell was put on, and then the surface of the background, the papier-mâché, was built up to the level of the shell. But just look, it's something to go out with, isn't it? Fancy just leaving you looking at a table like that. Oh, I'm beginning to like this stuff myself.
One of the great successes of the 1851 exhibition was the hand-carved furniture of what was called the Warwick School, who specialised in large narrative carvings on overmantels, sideboards and things like that. Now in the dining room at Charlecote Park in Warwickshire, this famous piece, which was made by Wilcox of Warwick, illustrates the resources of nature and the trophies of the chase. It was presented to Queen Victoria, who said it was a masterpiece of genius and skill, but alas, she had no room for it. The Warwick School were the forerunners of a reaction against the deadening effects of mass production, which was led by William Morris. Now, he was a middle-class socialist intellectual who dreamed of a world where, in his own words, men had employment that would foster their self-respect and live in surroundings that would soothe and elevate them. And he wanted to return to the medieval ideals of craftsmanship, particularly the honesty of design and construction. Morris's most famous dictum was, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." In 1861, he founded a firm which he described as a company of historical artists. Their partners included the pre-Raphaelite painters Burne-Jones and Rossetti, whose ideals really had very much in common with Morris's own. One of their first products was wallpaper, some of it designed by Burne-Jones, some by Morris, patterned usually with floral motifs linked by scrolling stems. And they made furniture like this, based on traditional designs, particularly from Sussex. Philip Webb was the firm's principal furniture designer. Both Morris and Webb believed that furniture design should grow naturally from good craftsmanship and functional simplicity, and that it should never depend on styles debased by commercial exploitation. This didn't prevent them, however, from producing furniture which in the main could only be afforded by the well-to-do. And there were others who began to bring their own personal approaches to furniture design. William Burgess, for example, an architect who looked to medieval themes for his interior decoration and furniture. This is one of the rooms at Castell in South Wales. But his medievalism was more sophisticated than Morris's and was far removed from the spirit of the medieval joiner. This sideboard of ebonized wood was designed by E.W. Godwin, another prominent name. Now, he'd been very struck with the Japanese furniture that had been displayed at another big exhibition in London in 1862, and much of his furniture reflects Japanese forms. This piece, as you can see, certainly has an oriental feel about it, and considering it was made in 1867, it's one of the most forward-looking examples of mid-Victorian furniture. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, there were two important stylistic movements happening at the same time. The first was the arts and crafts movement, which derived its inspiration from William Morris's ideas, and the second was the Art Nouveau movement, which in different forms and under different names was establishing itself at this time throughout Europe. Even in this country, there were many different styles, but they all had the same basic philosophy behind them, which was to break away from styles borrowed from previous eras and to create something which really was entirely new. And sometimes, indeed, it's difficult to make a firm distinction between the influences of these two movements. The pioneer group of the arts and crafts movement was the Century Guild, founded by A.H. McMurdo in 1882. This is a small oak desk designed by him. In essence, it's a handcrafted piece along the same William Morris principles, and yet it has elements of what we would now recognize as Art Nouveau ideas. And this chair, which McMurdo designed as early as 1882, can certainly be seen as one of the first pieces of Art Nouveau. One of the most distinctive features of the whole idea of Art Nouveau you can see there in that free curving line and those seaweed-like swirls, so absolutely typical of Art Nouveau design. Again, Charles Annesley Voysey, who made this dresser, is considered to be an English Art Nouveau designer, but he was really much closer to the arts and crafts movement. The most celebrated Art Nouveau designer was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Like Robert Adam, he was a Scottish architect, and also, like Adam, he believed that the design of a room should convey the impression of a harmonious whole. He avoided any reference to historical styles, and his highly personal brand of Art Nouveau, based on geometrical designs, particularly the cube, must be considered as a major influence of the development of furniture design in the 20th century. He seemed particularly fond of white rooms and white furniture, some of it fitted, some of it freestanding. Many of his chairs had particularly tall backs, and this one, with a back that's over 4 feet high, is one of his most memorable designs. Well, from a very individual style of chair to a type that is more typically English than any other, and one which really came to the fore in Victorian times, it is, of course, the Windsor chair. Its traditional home is in the Chilterns, and, like generations of craftsmen before him, Stuart Linford, who has a workshop at Great Missenden near High Wycombe,
finds much of his raw material near at hand.
Saplings like this in ash, yew and beech will find their way into his small workshop to become integral parts of the Windsor chairs he produces by traditional hand methods in several equally traditional styles. After the bark is roughly stripped away with a draw knife, this sapling will be bent to make an arm bow or back bow for a chair. But before the wood is pliable enough to be bent, it must spend up to 3 hours in the steamer. In Stuart's case, a rather Heath Robinson contraption, which is nonetheless very effective. It's fed by a drum of water which is kept boiling on the workshop stove. And in a workshop like this, there's no shortage of fuel. Probably the most physically taxing part of the process is the shaping of the familiar saddled seat, which is done with a razor-sharp bottomer's adze. The 2-inch thick elm seat must be reduced in some places by over an inch. The final shape is most important to the comfort of the eventual sitter, and the travishing knife leaves a smooth, curved finish. The holes for the legs have to be bored at exactly the right angle, and here Stuart demonstrates the efficiency of the spoon bit and brace. Though it's long been a museum piece, it still does a perfect job. This type of bit starts easily at any angle and produces a smooth, clean hole. Meanwhile, the fire has kept the saplings steaming away. Once out of the steamer, they cool quickly, so the forming around the bending block has to be done immediately. It's another hard job, and one which is frequently disappointing. Often only 3 or 4 saplings out of every 10 survive the bending process to become the arm bow or the back bow of a chair. This one was successful, and it must be kept bent like this for 10 to 14 days to ensure that it retains its new shape. It's then thinned down with a series of spoke shaves to about half its original diameter. The one real concession that Stuart Linford makes to modern machinery is a powered lathe. The beechwood legs, understretchers and backsticks are all produced this way, decorated with their familiar rings and swells. Next comes the legging up, and as one might expect, traditional animal glues are preferred to more modern adhesives. And it's not just the whim of this particular craftsman. If a repair should become necessary later in the life of the chair, these joints can be easily steamed apart selectively without damaging the rest of the chair. The beechwood backsticks are similarly glued into place, and the chair finally begins to take shape. Why is it called a Windsor chair? Well, one story is that George III, sheltering from the rain in a cottage while out hunting in Windsor Great Park, found a chair of this type to be very comfortable and ordered some for Windsor Castle. Unfortunately, that story can't be true, as a Windsor chair was mentioned by name in a document as early as 1724. Another theory, and one that's possibly more acceptable, is that the chairs made in the Wickham area were sent down the Thames to Windsor. From here they were sent on to London. In the Londoner's mind, they'd been more directly associated with Windsor than with Wickham. But certainly the region in and around what's now High Wycombe evolved as the centre of the English chair-making industry. Between 1800 and 1860, the number of workshops rose from 1 or 2 to 150. And by 1870, their total output had risen to about 5,000 chairs a day. That's 1.5 million a year.
And this is the very chair we saw being made, a fine example which continues the best traditions of English craftsmanship right into the 20th century. Now, Edwardian England was almost as prosperous and extravagant as the England of the Regency had been, and it also had something of the same elegance and style. So you might therefore have expected that it would have produced the same creative exuberance which typified a lot of Regency furniture. But in fact, there were really no new developments at all. Most of the fashionable drawing rooms of the day were furnished in the manner of the late 18th century, either with genuine antiques, which people were now beginning to buy, or with reproductions of Sheraton or Hepplewhite furniture. And the quality of some of this Edwardian furniture, like for instance this settee, really is remarkably high. The Art Nouveau style had also carried through into the early years of the 20th century, though it was soon to fade away, and some of it, interestingly enough, was rather evocative of Sheraton, like this chair. And in the settle behind me, we really have a mixture of design influences, basically arts and crafts in its design, and yet here in this central decorative panel we have a piece of pure Art Nouveau. Now, this dressing table over here was produced by Liberty's, which was a shop set up in the late 19th century and which incidentally evolved its own style of Art Nouveau. This piece, however, is very much Liberty's version of an arts and crafts piece. In all probability, it was machine-made and then finished off by hand. But some of the best furniture of the period was made by cabinet makers of the Cotswold School, who, as part of the arts and crafts movement, had established themselves in the last years of the 19th century. Ernest Jimpson and Ernest and Sidney Barnsley worked on the principles laid down by William Morris, and their designs belonged to the timeless tradition of country furniture. One of the basic features of their work was honesty of construction, and although they didn't object to the use of machinery in their work, if it didn't remove their pleasure in making it, they certainly believed that they had to be closely in touch with their materials at every stage. And so any thought of mass production would have been totally against their philosophy. During the 20s, the cabinet makers in general continued to play safe, and the manufacturers were waiting for the one thing that the English furniture industry really needed more than anything else, and that was good original designs for the mass production of furniture by machine. Well, these designs didn't really come until the late 20s and 30s with the work of men like Ambrose Heel and Gordon Russell. Now, both those designers were Englishmen, but as we've seen so often before in the story of the development of English furniture, continental influences were also brought to bear. One very strong influence came from the so-called Bauhaus school, which had been founded in Weimar by Dr. Walter Gropius in 1919, and which set the pace for avant-garde architecture and design throughout the 20s. It influenced the work of men like the Frenchman Le Corbusier and the American Frank Lloyd Wright. New techniques and new materials were constantly being used now: tubular steel, aluminium, plywood, glass, and even canvas. In 1929, one particularly notable piece of continental furniture was made by Mies van der Rohe, who had previously designed the first cantilever chair. He exhibited this chair with a cast steel frame at an exhibition in Barcelona. Ever since then, it's been known as the Barcelona chair, and it was described at the time as perhaps the most beautiful modern chair in existence. Indeed, it's still being reproduced today. Now, during the war, the chronic shortage of timber and the needs of bombed-out families resulted in a government-sponsored scheme for producing utility furniture, as it came to be called. It's not really very beautiful, is it? And its sponsors tried very hard to popularize its simple lines and economical construction. But they were really trying to make a virtue out of necessity. And in spite of their efforts, the very word utility has come to mean in our language shoddy and second-rate.
and even when the war was over, it was some time before the furniture trade was free of the enforced economies and timber controls of wartime. Any firm working with native timbers naturally found the going easier than those relying on imports. The Urquhart factory at High Wycombe based their entire output, as they still do, on pine, beech and elm. Elm was traditionally used for making gates, stiles, coffins and wheelbarrows rather than furniture. It's a temperamental timber and it needs special treatment and special equipment. The steam kilns can be set to a predetermined heat and humidity. This method of forcing a straight piece of wood into a curve has proved to be by far the most effective yet evolved. In the steam press, the nature of the wood itself is changed, and every curve becomes permanent and will survive in any climate. It'll also be absolutely symmetrical every time, something even the finest craftsmen would have found hard to achieve by the old methods. The almost mystical value some of us give to anything that's been made by hand is really a byproduct of the machine age. It began with William Morris, who loathed machines and set great store by traditional hand craftsmanship. And yet, most of the methods used in the construction of this furniture are traditional. The dowels, dovetails and wedge joints are those used by English joiners for centuries. In the economic climate of today, it's the cost of labour which is crucial in determining the price of any article. A turner working by hand will take several minutes to make a chair leg, for instance. A machine can do the job in seconds. And if Morris could have seen this process, he would almost certainly have given it his blessing. He wanted to bring well-made furniture to a mass market, but he failed. Lucian Ercolani, the founder of the company, was born in Italy, but spent most of his life in England. And, like Morris, he had a real love for traditional English furniture. He also wanted to bring good craftsmanship within the reach of the less well-off, to provide, as he said, a work of simple originality for the people. One of his small and relatively cheap Windsor chairs made of elm and beech, using just 14 pieces of wood, is turned out at this factory every 20 seconds. Ercolani felt strongly that the natural creativeness of his craftsmen should never be frustrated. The machines are there to take the drudgery out of repetitive work and to release his craftsmen to exploit their skills wherever that's possible. The furniture is, of course, designed for mass production. The handles and supports, fairly plain and functional, can be turned out by the machines in their hundreds of thousands. But there is one range based on early American furniture which carries some decoration. The chairs are ornamented first by shapes drilled out by machine. Later, the design is finished by carvers working by hand. Most furniture manufacturers today work with an eye to the export market, and Urquhart send about 30% of their products abroad. But they haven't changed their style in pursuit of changing tastes and fashions. Their designs are still based on traditional furniture. At Parnham House near Beaminster in Dorset, where John Makepeace has his workshops, no design is ever repeated. He's working, of course, for a very different market,
for clients who can afford to commission a piece of furniture which will be unique, like this desk, for example, which is made of holly, Macassar ebony, Lebanon cedar, ivory, and buffalo suede. But there are students at Parnham as well. Last year, an educational trust was formed, and John Makepeace now directs the School for Craftsmen in Wood. This small cabinet was made by one of his students, and it's exactly the same sort of thing as had been made by young craftsmen for many centuries. It is, of course, an apprentice piece, made for the appraisal of the apprentice master. And here, something made by the master himself, John Makepeace. It really is a most remarkable piece of furniture in birch and spruce, plywood and acrylic. He calls it a display cabinet. Use it for what you will. It occupies itself a very limited space, and yet look at the storage that it provides in all these round containers. It's full of quality, it's unique, it's a one-off, and I'm sure will be discussed in hundreds of years from now because it's been bought by the Victoria and Albert Museum.
And that really brings the story of English furniture right up to date. We're now well into the second half of the 20th century, and it's interesting that the fine furniture of today, like that display cabinet of John Makepeace, is already in a museum rather than someone's house. Why? Because it's already rare. The age of fine craftsmanship is all but at an end. We're now in the age of mass production and the three-piece suite. No bad thing, since millions more homes are far better furnished today than they ever were in Chippendale's day. But mass production, by its very nature, means that you lose something in quality, and never again are we likely to see furniture made in this country of the quality of that produced in the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, and which you've seen in these videograms. From Arthur Negus and myself, goodbye.